Pei Lin is a Taiwanese-American ethnoarchaeologist with 35 years of experience in public and academic archaeology. She currently serves as a tribal liaison with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Her research interests center on hunter-gatherer societies and the interface with gardening and small-scale farming. Her research career began among the hunter-gatherers of Venezuela, and she currently studies the evolutionary role of gardening in the Neolithic onset in Taiwan, Southeast China, of southern Japan, as this area was a crucible for the seafaring gardening societies of Oceania. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to you so we keep going rather than keep reading. The rest of this bio is in the program, so yes, turning it over to Pei Lin.
Good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen here. I hope you can see my first slide. Could I get a thumbs up if we can see my slide?
Yep, we
Yes.
can see.
All right, fabulous, thank you. All right, actually it's funny, I should have revised my bio because I'm not going to be talking about any of those things today. I'm going to be talking about something somewhat different, but I think it's very appropriate for RIVAS, which is the Revitalization of Indigenous Body Sovereignty and Tattoo Cultures in Taiwan. I am not, in fact, Taiwan indigenous, although I'm honored to have had a great-great-grandmother who was from the Plains people. So this is more from an etic perspective. So, my show here. There we go. I'm just going to read the slide, so please forgive me just in the interest of keeping time. Taiwan has a very rich tradition of body imagery, and it's actually associated with the Austronesian diaspora and tattoo cultures of Oceania. But between 1895 and the 1980s, so almost 100 years, colonial governments banned tattooing, ritual scarring, and other forms of body modification. These bans were not merely aesthetic nor political, they intentionally struck at the heart of indigenous worldviews, knowledge systems, and body sovereignty. The intention was first to disrupt and then erase the physical expression of the body's relationships with yourself, with your own identity, the community around you, the spiritual world, the ancestors, and the natural world. Basically, the whole thing is wrapped up in tattoo culture. So today I'll briefly review the history of those bans and the labor of indigenous Taiwanese since the revoking of the bans to restore body sovereignty through traditional tattooing. Some working principles I am working from are that indigenous sovereignty, and this is a term that's not used very often in Taiwan, but I'm using it for this audience because many English-speaking peoples do work with this concept in the indigenous world. Indigenous sovereignty and autonomy are embodied in the land, the things that live in it, the human families and communities, and in the persons of individuals. So all scale that is applied to sovereignty. The sovereignty of communities, which is ratified or documented through treaties and other political mechanisms that recognize pre-existing rights as expressed through self-determination, health, subsistence, education, the creation and enforcement of laws, and of course land rights and ownership. Individual sovereignty is the autonomy and animacy of the individual human being, and also I would say other living organisms with inherent agency and compassed by the body and the space that it occupies. The possession of individual sovereignty is foundational for the health of all societies. And this is uniquely true in the case of women's body sovereignty and autonomy, which is something I'm looking into. I brought up the concept of rematriation for Anna in this talk yesterday. But I'm just going to keep it somewhat general and expansive today. I visualize sovereignty through a number of actions and phenomena that are going on in Taiwan. Sorry?
No, I had to speak.
Okay. Shall I continue?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I see sovereignty at the root of the tree of this phenomenon of indigenization. Basically, we talk about recolonization, repatriation, indigenization, rematriation, which is like repatriation, only it's more focused on the feminine principle, co-stewardship and co-creation of knowledge and culture towards self-governance, and even influence to non-indigenous societies. I see this as sort of a cycle that is rooted in pre-existing sovereignty and also feeds the roots of ongoing sovereignty. In Taiwan, sovereignty is evolving rapidly. Starting in the 1980s and 90s, so quite late, is when Chinese language associated laws began to open up avenues for indigenous Taiwanese to recover sovereignty, or to basically bring it out into the open, where they've been curating it for many, many years. Taiwan's Indigenous Peoples Basic Law, 2015, established consultation with indigenous communities for government activities and compensation for land takes and other activities that harm indigenous communities. The use of the term mountain peoples, which began during the Qing Dynasty, was carried forward into other colonizing governments, has been changed in official and public life to Yetumi, which is originally residing people, which is probably closer to the English term of Aboriginal or Indigenous, and you'll see that in translations a lot in this literature. Since 2015, there's been a lot of change, very rapid change going on, and yet not enough. But one of the things that has been advancing is government recognition of individual tribal groups. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Shiraya tribe was officially recognized by the Taiwanese government. I don't have all of the different groups on this map, but this gives you a rough idea of where people are situated geographically in Taiwan. 17 officially recognized tribes at the moment, with at least 11 tribes seeking that recognition. I think that that will continue to advance. Amis, Ataya, Taiwan, Phenom, Pinu, Yu, Mayan, Rukai, Zo, Saisia, Yami, Pao, Kavalam, Trufu, Sakibaya, Sehi, Lahalawa, Kanakanamu, and Shiraya most recently. You'll notice these tribal areas are concentrated on the eastern side of Taiwan. I should have given you a better map. Taiwan is basically just off the southeast coast of China, separated by only a few kilometers of the Taiwan Strait. But as you can see on the eastern side is where the tribal group, sort of where the tribal lands and territories are concentrated today. There were many, many peoples, of course, encompassing the entire island, and the plains of the west coast were colonized very early by Chinese agriculturalists, by Dutch traders and others, sort of pushing tribes to the east up into the central mountains or onto the east coast. And the so-called people, or plains peoples, were very rapidly absorbed into dominant cultures. They're still there, and they are among the most active peoples today seeking federal recognition, although they don't have lands delineated. As in all colonized situations across the globe, indigenous sovereignty is incompletely realized. There are a number of active areas being pursued by indigenous communities, including land restoration, the siting of nuclear and other infrastructure. This is very tense in terms of Taiwan is a small island, and they have very limited real estate for large nuclear projects, for wind turbines, for military infrastructure, and a lot of it has been sited on indigenous lands. Gun-assisted traditional hunting is a very big controversy in indigenous Taiwan. They have been using rifles for hundreds of years, and guns are essentially completely illegal in Taiwan. So there's an ongoing dialogue about the use of guns in indigenous hunting. And also the surnaming of children with one indigenous parent. Recently, a law requiring such a child to have an indigenous surname was overturned, and so that is also a rapidly evolving situation. Taiwan is Asia's prime free speech democracy. Some of you probably read in the papers about the difficulties with China threatening to overtake Taiwan, seize it by force. But at the moment, Taiwan is a vibrant free speech democracy with marriage equality and robust laws about indigenous governance. But given that, indigeneity in Taiwan can socially integrate individuals but still brush aside sovereignty claims if they conflict with the aims of the state, according to Ani scholar Alilona. But I want to bring up the case of traditional tattooing as an example of body sovereignty that has been really, really severely curtailed and is now revitalizing. And this is due to credit of indigenous practitioners who are reclaiming this pre-existing, very ancient right. The tattooing tradition, I'm a recovering archaeologist. I'm still an archaeologist, but this won't be an archaeology paper. This is my doff of the hat to mention that the ancestors of today's indigenous Taiwan people have been there for at least 8,000 years before Han Chinese settlement in the 17th century. And I would mention that we actually have documentation of human presence in Taiwan as early as 30,000 years ago, but the tattooing culture itself is confirmed as early as 1,400 years ago. The Ataya, Tutu, Paisia, Taiwan, Yukai, Kuyuma, and Zou people are all known to have practiced tattooing in the past. And today, or I would say in the ethnographic present, since people have been talking and documenting about these practices, the Ataya, Puruku, Seidik, and Saisiat have applied designs to the face and hands. These are a couple of historical photos that show the men's tattoos on the forehead and jaw. They're a little faded in this photograph, but if you look closely, you can see. This gentleman has both forehead and chin tattoos. And women have forehead and cheeks tattoos. And usually this would, there are many, many different sort of social contexts for when people were expected to get tattoos or when they earned the right to get them. Generally, it was very much done as you were coming in of age and looking to start a family of your own. And I'll be mentioning researcher Kimi Siba, who is a guy who has been working for really more than 25 years on revitalizing this practice. Siba's interviews include facial tattooing as a very intense experience. This is done with the traditional tapping that you may have seen for the Polynesian practice, with a great deal of pain so that people often could not open their mouths, speak or eat for days after the practice. And throughout this practice, men are expected to have proved themselves as worthy hunters and women as skilled weavers. So in some of these studies, adults had to earn these tattoos and as such were designated as excellent adults who deserved to join their ancestors in the afterlife. In other groups, younger children were even tattooed. And in some cases of such Taiwan and Yukai, who have very hierarchical societies with nobles, those who were not tattooed risked being expelled or having lower social status in their village. Gejulan, also known as Lala Peg, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name properly because I'm not a speaker of Ataya. She is a tribal member in the northern county of Miali, was 95 years old in 2018, and she was interviewed by Mr. Sabal. And she recalled that there was social pressure to be tattooed at a relatively young age of 15. The older people in her community told her, if you don't get a tattoo, people can't tell whether you're from the Ataya tribe, which is a mountain tribe, or a plains person, the so-called Pingpu tribes, who, as far as we know, did not have a tattooing tradition. So from this vibrant and diverse tattooing culture, we enter the discussion on colonization. Taiwan has been colonized again and again. There were small groups of farmers coming over from China in the early 1600s, but it was really Spanish and especially the Dutch, who came over in the 1620s, established large settlements, including armed forts, and who seized indigenous lands, as well as labor of indigenous people to extract from indigenous communities a lot of labor, especially in the hunting of the local Sika deer. If you look at pictures across Asia, look at Asia's ruling societies from India across through China and Japan, you'll notice a lot of, I should have put an image here, spotted deer hides were considered a high status element of costume of royals across Asia, and many of those spotted Sika deer hides came from Taiwan through the Dutch and made enormous amounts of money from them. Despite this huge impact, especially to the coastal, the western coastal tribes, body sovereignty was really kind of left alone along with languages. So as long as indigenous people were willing to contribute their labor and step back from some of their lands, their languages and body sovereignty were largely left alone. These images show Dutch depictions of Plains indigenous people, as well as Japanese images of mountain indigenous people. Excuse me, not Japanese, this is Qing Dynasty China on the right side. After a naval battle in 1895, the Qing Dynasty of China, which had been governing Taiwan since the 1600s, after expelling the Dutch, it's a long, complicated history. The Qing Dynasty did yield or cede Taiwan to the Japanese Meiji Empire. The empire had basically said, as an instrument of surrender, we demand Taiwan, but we are very interested in creating a model colony out of it and extracting as much timber and to some lesser extent mineral wealth from Taiwan as possible. The impacts of indigenous people are almost incalculable from the Japanese colonization. Among other things, they removed most of the native Taiwanese forests from the central mountains, including mother trees that were revered by indigenous people, and some of which were 4,000 to 5,000 years old. Using a model from the United States, the Japanese government suppressed warfare between indigenous groups, nationalized their territories, which included forested land, and relocated communities downslope away from their ancestral lands. I talked a little bit about this a couple of years ago in this very same conference. Industrial logging and cultivation of rice for the Japanese military industrial complex dominated the Taiwanese countryside, and large infrastructure projects like paved roads, railways, factories, and other infrastructure grew in the urban areas. Special schools trained young indigenous people in Japanese culture, forbidding them to speak their home languages, and preparing them for labor in the industrializing economy and military. So again, the Japanese used a United States model, and probably were also watching in Canada and Australia and other colonizing places, and Russia, I imagine, as well, although I know nothing about Russia, for basically inculcating colonizer or settler languages and values to indigenous children. And direct denial of body sovereignty included a ban on traditional tattooing starting in 1916. Like all of these other aspects of indigenous life, including warfare, religious ceremonies, traditional language and clothing, tattooing was viewed by Japanese officials in the government as barbaric and subversive, and indigenous children were taught accordingly in those schools. This image on the upper left-hand side is a Japanese-run school for indigenous children. The crackdowns on tattooing included threatening to bar tattooed youngsters from schools, imposing punishments including flogging, imprisonment, and forced labor, and fines on the adults. The penal code imposed really severe penalties for adults, and both for those who were viewed as receiving the tattoos and those practitioners of the traditional art. And this image is a Japanese colonial policeman being carried by indigenous people. These kinds of photographs, to me, really illustrate the Japanese colonial presence in this model colony of theirs, and their intention A bit as with Ekaterina's paper, with the intention of modernizing indigenous people towards the Asian Pacific theater that they were seeking to create. This picture is Mona Rudao, who is a Sadic band member and leader who led one of the bloodiest uprisings against the Japanese government. Some of you may have heard of Warriors of the Rainbow, which is a film completed in 2016 about this uprising. It has some historical inaccuracies, but it does give you a picture of what this uprising may have felt like or seemed like to indigenous people for movie viewers. These uprisings were very violently suppressed. Tattooing did continue very quietly, but basically indigenous tattooing was driven underground, especially with the important practice of facial and hand tattooing. And young people who had been tattooed before the ban or who were discovered had to undergo incredibly painful removal. We didn't have, the laser techniques that are going on today, so it basically involved the removal of the skin. And Taiwanese indigenous tattooing, as a result, ceased by the early 1930s. After Japan lost the Second World War, the Allies placed Taiwan under the Republic of China for governance, without consulting either the non-indigenous or indigenous people, and under the ensuing White Terror period in which Chiang Kai-shek imposed the longest known period of martial law in the history of the world. Indigenous languages and tattooing continued to be forbidden. So it wasn't much of an improvement for indigenous Taiwanese to be governed by the Republic of China, which, for those of you who are also versed in the history of this area, the Republic of China was pushed out of the mainland by the communists and governed Taiwan as its stronghold for a very long time. During this time, tattoo motifs were basically curated carefully through other forms of ornamentation, including weaving was a major way to do this, as well as ceramics, and the placement of these designs on everyday objects to make sure that they were curated even though they could not be placed directly onto the body. And with the late 1980s and Taiwan's democracy movement, the acknowledgement of indigenous identities and pre-existing rights in the law and constitution opened up new space in politics and culture for the revitalization of traditional tattooing. Amazingly, there were many tribal elder women by the 1980s who still had these facial tattoos. I need to do some more reading into how these women managed to get this done after the 1930s and not be forcibly having to remove it. But by the 1990s, there was a really growing sense of urgency that we needed to talk with these women and help them and their culture document these beautiful traditions of traditional tattooing. Iwan Gainu and Lawado Yu are both since passed away. These are some photographs of these ladies who had the traditional facial hand tattoos. Hualien, which is on the eastern side of the island in 2009, listed traditional facial tattoo practices of Dayan Sadi and Lugu as cultural heritage. So in Taiwan, there is a system of designating cultural heritage practices, both tangible and intangible, not unlike the National Register. In the United States, only much more expansive because the National Register doesn't talk about intangible heritage. In 2016, Ibai Lan and others were named as preservers of the art form, and Mr. Kim Sibao, pictured here on the left, with Iwan Gainu, conducted many interviews, I think hundreds of them, and took documentary photographs, especially of women who had managed to acquire and wear tattoos throughout their lives. As a result of this, young Taiwanese indigenous people now have access to knowledge about tattooing. And I'm not sure where I am on time. Is there a time to show a video, or should I just continue? I placed the link to the video in the chat as well. It's about 4 minutes.
Sure.
I think it should be Q&A now, but yeah.
Okay, you know what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go forward, and then we can, I invite people to look at the YouTube on their own. It's very good. It shows a modern Taiwan woman priestess and leader of her community who is very young, obtaining her traditional tattoos. It's very inspiring and beautiful. In November of 2026, I would like to sort of give a shout out to the National Museum of Prehistory in Taiwan. They have been hosting Tattoo Waves, which is a wonderful festival. They did it also in 2025. I think it's going to be an annual event, which invites all peoples who are related to Taiwanese indigenous people, including the peoples of Polynesia and Australasia and Oceania, to come to Taiwan and exchange knowledge about traditional tattooing. So California, Philippines, Aotearoa, Hawaii, and Taiwan and Revitalization communities of Taiwan all gathering at this museum. I will be privileged to attend this wonderful event, although I am myself not a practitioner. So sort of wrapping this up, I would like to sort of mention that body sovereignty is part of sovereignty that feeds the roots of indigeneity in Taiwan, and also goes right up towards, through the many branches of the tree towards co-stewardship, knowledge, co-creation, self-governance, revitalization, and influence to other societies. I will mention that there's an enormous interest in Taiwanese traditional tattooing growing throughout the global community of tattoos, not restricted necessarily to Oceania. So in conclusion, despite the skipped generations, younger indigenous people are acting out. And realizing that you need to remember your traditionals and not let people scold you, which I thought that was a great way for Mr. Subal to state the revitalization principle. And now I'll open it up for questions. Thank you very much. In fact, before I stop sharing, I want to show you, these are two ladies from the Amis tribe who did have traditional tattooing put onto their hands and arms, and you can see the level of detail. These are non-traditional designs, but they are actually archaeology tattoos that show ancient village remains in the form of masonry at the base of another tree. Okay, now I will cease sharing and open it up for any questions you may have.
Actually, I have a question. First, good to hear from Pei Lin. Just out of curiosity, why did Japanese prohibit tattooing? What was the rationale behind it? Do you know?
The reason for the ban?
Yeah. Japanese, yeah. Why?
Yeah, I think that they were, to some extent, hoping to modernize indigenous Taiwanese, and tattooing was seen as very backward. But I also think that there was a political element to that, which is along with the language, along with the clothing. Tattooing was seen as barbaric. And if we were going to, if the Japanese government was going to create a model colony, which is what they repeatedly called Taiwan, their model had to conform to the Japanese principle. You know that there are Japanese traditions of tattooing, but even today they are highly controversial and stigmatized. For example, you cannot go into a Japanese onsen with tattoos on your body. It's seen as potentially criminal. So I think that there's a lot of complicated attitudes toward tattooing in Japan, both in early times and even carrying up to the present. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? So,
There's a Zoom question, George.
Hi. So this was really a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. Sorry?
I can hear you okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I heard some interruption. Two questions. One, just a simple factual one. How many people are we talking about? What population figures among all of these tribes that you referred to? are there? And then secondly, I'm curious about the relationships, the current relationships between the different tribes, whether there is something like a pan-indigenous identity, whether there are alliances or disputes. You alluded to an earlier history of warfare, indigenous warfare. And of course, here in the United States and in other settler colonial situations, these differences have been exploited by colonizers. And they continue to be in a number of these circumstances. So I'm curious about that aspect.
Great questions both. To my knowledge today, Taiwan indigenous societies and populations combined make up about 2% of the population. So probably between, I think, 400 and 500,000 people at this time. That's just based on my sort of back of the envelope remembrance of those numbers. In terms of the warfare question, which is very important to Taiwanese indigenous society, these groups actually had such diversity. We think that there were probably between 32 and 36 tribes in Taiwan, each of them with their own distinct language. So it looks a little bit like Papua New Guinea in terms of language diversity, tremendous diversity. And it's the languages of the Central Mountains and East Coast that are apparently ancestral to many of the languages of Hawaii and Tahiti. So very, very fascinating there. The warfare principle for them was, as with many indigenous societies, warfare was considered utterly essential to territorial integrity and to the maintenance of spiritual values. Taiwanese people in the past, especially the mountain peoples, had a tradition of taking heads. This was, of course, forbidden immediately by the Japanese government. But there's a highly ritualized body of knowledge around that practice. So today, of course, since warfare has been, outright warfare has been banned since the 1890s, I would say there is a lot of conversation between indigenous tribes of Taiwan now using Mandarin Chinese as a lingua franca, although there's a lot of language revitalization going on as well. They have an indigenous council, which is actually part of their Congress. I would love to see that here. To have an indigenous body within the U.S. Congress would be amazing. I would love to see that. We don't have that now. We have a number of other Congresses which are independent of our U.S. Congress. They have one embedded in their parliament. And that is where representatives from all the groups meet and talk about their interface with their governments and with the governments of the nation. I think there are also other pan-Taiwan indigenous groups that meet on a regular basis aside from that. So I would say that they are in lots of conversation, and also the conversations with New Zealand indigenous people, with Hawaiian indigenous people, Tahitian indigenous people, Borneo. These are really getting big, and they feel almost like government-to-government conversations, although they're not labeled as that. But there are a lot of sort of diplomatic relations between the tribes of Oceania and the tribes of Taiwan. And I think tattoo culture is a really nice thread to follow that connection outwards. So great questions, thank you. I hope that addressed them.
Thank you, it sure did.
All right.